The current king of Sweden, Carl XVI Gustav, carries in his veins a name deeply ostracized by history. His mother, Princess Sibylla of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Had history followed its normal course, she would have been lauded as the benevolent Queen of Sweden. However, history has completely erased her. The reason is dark and fatal. Her father was Adolf Hitler's most ardent supporter and a high-ranking Nazi official. In early 20th century Europe, the institution of royalty stood at a crossroads. After the catastrophic smoke of World War I cleared, the great empires that had dominated the European continent collapsed like dominoes. The families that had wielded absolute power, Russia's Romanovs, Germany's Hohenzollerns, and Austria's Habsburgs, were obliterated by the maelstrom of revolution and war. The few surviving royal families were gripped by extreme fear. To maintain their power and survival, they resorted to the most primitive and ancient method, strategic marriages of blood or politically arranged marriages. The union between Prince Gustav Adolf, heir to the Swedish throne, and Princess Sibylla of Germany was precisely an extension of this survival instinct. The root of their union lay deep within the complex and fatal contradictions hidden in their bloodlines. Sibylla and Gustav Adolf were both great-granddaughter and great-grandson of Queen Victoria, who led the British Empire during its heyday. They were second cousins. This incestuous union was the result of an obsession with preserving the purity of the bloodlines of declining European royal families. However, this blind obsession with pure blood became a political trap for Sibylla, from which she could not escape. Born in 1908, Princess Sibylla's background was anything but ordinary. Her father, Duke Karl Edward of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was the central figure and mastermind behind this tragedy. Born a member of the British royal family, he fought on the side of Germany rather than his native Britain during World War I. As a result, he was stripped of all British titles and privileges under the Title Deprivation Act, enacted by the British Parliament in 1917. Once a proud prince of the British Empire, he was suddenly branded a traitor and completely expelled from the British crown. This profound humiliation and anger completely distorted Karl Edward's psychology. He came to hate the British democracy and the established system that had abandoned him. And in the 1920s, when the poisonous mushrooms of fascism began to sprout in Germany, still reeling from defeat, he walked into that darkness without hesitation. He was no mere Nazi sympathizer. He was one of Hitler's most potent supporters, and as a high-ranking member of the stormtroopers and president of the German Red Cross, he became the aristocratic face of the Nazi regime's legitimacy. Princess Sibylla grew up in this toxic environment. Coburg, where she grew up, was not just a small German town. It was the literal cradle of Nazism, the first city in all of Germany to elect a Nazi mayor. The daily reality that filled Sibylla's childhood was not one of royal elegance. The walls were increasingly covered with swastikas, and in the living room, Nazis in brown uniforms drank wine with her father and discussed racism. Her daily life was tainted by the madness of fascism. It is at this point that Princess Sibylla's fatal weakness is formed. Growing up in the authoritarian German imperial environment, she was deeply ingrained in her passive attitude of absolute obedience to her father's will. She never questioned his extreme political choices. While possessing a sense of superiority as an aristocrat, she lacked the political insight to interpret the changing times ahead. She completely failed to grasp the fundamental survival principle of modern monarchy, that royalty must transcend political ideology, she failed to separate her filial piety from the great evils of history. This naive yet fatal obedience would lead her to ruin for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, across the Baltic Sea, Sweden faced a completely different dilemma. The Bernadotte dynasty of Sweden, descended from the commoner general Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte during the French Revolution, was constantly conscious of its inherent lack of legitimacy, and to compensate, constantly yearned for intermarriage with one of Europe's most venerable royal houses. Finding a match for Prince Gustav Adolf was the Swedish crown's most important national task. Moreover, Sweden at the time was desperately trying to maintain its neutrality amidst the turmoil of two world wars, a policy that would ultimately determine the nation's fate. For the Swedes, who abhorred war and longed for peace, fascism and militarism were like contagious diseases to be absolutely avoided. The political landscape, dominated by the Swedish Social Democratic Party, was gradually diminishing the royal family's privileges, and the monarchy could not survive without the love and support of the people. Against this backdrop, when Prince Gustav Adolf met and fell in love with Princess Sibylla in London in 1931, it set off serious alarm bells within the Swedish royal family. On the surface, their meeting was a romantic affair between two young and beautiful royals. However, the Swedish government and senior royal advisors were well aware of Sibylla's background. The fact that her father was a key Nazi figure who frequently met with Adolf Hitler shocked the politicians in Stockholm. It was a perfect dramatic contradiction. The Swedish people longed for a pure and beautiful fairy tale princess who would distract them from the horrors of the coming war. But Prince Gustav Adolf's chosen bride was a Trojan horse, a fairy tale on the outside, concealing Nazi Germany's political ambitions. From Germany's perspective, this marriage was a brilliant geopolitical tool. Hitler and the Nazi leadership actively supported it through Sibylla's father, Duke Karl Edward. They hoped that the woman who would become the next king of Sweden would be a staunch German sympathizer. Sibylla's marriage was not simply a union between a man and a woman. It was a giant chess piece designed to steer neutral Sweden's diplomatic policy toward Germany. How much Sibylla herself was aware of this vast geopolitical conspiracy is a matter of historical debate. However, what is clear is that she made no proactive effort to avoid this political trap. She took her father's political influence for granted and naively and arrogantly believed that the Swedish public would welcome her. Her fatal weakness, her passive obedience, left her completely oblivious to the immense storm looming over her. When their engagement was officially announced in 1932, the Swedish response was lukewarm. The country's leading media outlets expressed concern rather than congratulations. Anti-fascist citizens took to the streets to protest. For them, Sibylla was not the prince's beloved, but a sign that Hitler's shadow was looming over the Stockholm palace. The royal family tried to calm public outrage by emphasizing that the marriage was a purely private affair, but news from Sibylla's hometown of Coburg made their excuses seem meaningless. The upcoming wedding was not the culmination of a romantic relationship, but the official beginning of a cruel mechanism that would permanently isolate Sibylla from the Swedish public. Trapped in a bloodline, the princess was walking towards the cold political scaffold that lurked behind her smiling face. October 19, 1932. The wedding of Princess Sibylla and Prince Gustav Adolf in Coburg, Germany, is remembered as one of the most bizarre and macabre ceremonies in European royal history. The Swedes had expected a pure white dress, a magnificent carriage, and the culmination of a fairy tale romance. However, the macabre spectacle that filled the streets of Coburg that day was far from romantic. The entire city was transformed into a massive Nazi propaganda stage. Brown-shirted stormtroopers lined the streets leading to St. Peter's Church. On the building's facade, Swedish flags and Nazi swastikas fluttered in the wind. Instead of cheering the bride and groom, the crowd raised their arms in the fascist salute. Adolf Hitler himself even sent a congratulatory telegram to Sibylla's father, Prince Karl Edward, which was widely reported in the German press. The Swedish guests and diplomatic corps were horrified. The fact that the heir to the Swedish throne, a representative of a democratic nation, was exchanging wedding vows amidst a Nazi military parade was a near diplomatic disaster. King Gustav V of Sweden, grandfather of Prince Gustav Adolf, sensed the political repercussions of the wedding and refused to attend. While the Swedish royal family attempted to conceal this horrific visual contradiction, photographs from Coburg crossed the border and made the front pages of every Swedish newspaper. Sibylla's attitude at this horrific wedding scene most clearly reveals her psychological weakness. She accepted this unfamiliar landscape with complete ease. The swastika and the marching stormtroopers were not objects of fear for her, but rather the order established by her father, a familiar routine. She was completely oblivious to the extreme contradiction between her pure white wedding dress and the militaristic symbols that filled the streets. Standing in the midst of a historical tragedy, she saw herself as nothing more than an obedient daughter and a happy bride. Political apathy was the critical flaw that led to Sibylla's downfall. When the newlyweds arrived at the Stockholm train station, the immense wall of reality slammed into Sibylla. She was greeted not by enthusiastic cheers, but by a cold, hostile silence. The Swedish public refused to recognize her as the future queen. The word Nazi snaked through the crowds on the streets. The moment Sibylla set foot on Swedish soil, she was branded not as a fairy tale heroine, but as a spy dispatched by Sweden's greatest potential enemy. Sibylla's survival strategy in this hostile environment only exacerbated the situation. Language is the most powerful tool for royals to communicate and integrate with the public. However, Sibylla had tremendous difficulty learning Swedish. Her Swedish was always broken, and her accent bore a strong trace of her German roots. To the Swedes, her poor language skills were interpreted not simply as a lack of ability, but as a rejection of Swedish culture and the arrogance typical of German nobility. Unable to bear the cold gaze of the public, she chose to isolate herself. Sibylla and Prince Gustav Adolf moved to Haga Palace, located on the outskirts of Stockholm, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Surrounded by lush forests and a tranquil lake, this beautiful palace was Sibylla's only refuge. However, from a political perspective, Haga Palace became a splendid prison for her. The more she withdrew from the public eye, the more uncontrollable the rumors surrounding her became. Life at Haga Palace was seemingly tranquil, but inside it was filled with suffocating tension. The crown's most important duty was to produce a male heir to the throne. Sweden's laws of succession strictly prioritized males. Between 1934 and 1943, Sibylla gave birth to 4 daughters: Margareta, Birgitta, Desiree, and Christina. The Swedish public adored these adorable girls, calling them the Haga princesses. But the burden on Sibylla's shoulders grew heavier by the day. The anxiety of not being able to produce a male heir, combined with public political contempt, deeply affected Sibylla's psychology. She also constantly clashed with the Swedish servants within the palace. Her demands for strict, authoritarian, German-style discipline frequently clashed with the egalitarian Swedish social climate. Her husband, Prince Gustav Adolf, loved and protected her deeply, but he could not completely shield her from the country's anti-fascist sentiment. This mechanism of isolation reached its peak in 1939 with the outbreak of World War II. The European continent was engulfed in bloodshed, and Nazi Germany mercilessly invaded Sweden's neighbors, Norway and Denmark. Sweden, in a state of extreme fear, issued a general mobilization order and declared armed neutrality. It was a tense situation, with German troops potentially crossing the border at any moment. During this period, Sibylla's father, Duke Karl Edward, played a key role in covering up and supporting Nazi war crimes as president of the German Red Cross. He became Hitler's loyal dog and was directly and indirectly involved in the atrocities committed on the Polish and Soviet fronts. Every morning when the Swedish people read about Nazi massacres and bombings in their newspapers, their anger was directed at Sibylla, who sat in the Haga palace. Sibylla's psychological isolation was complete. While appalled by the actions of her native Germany, she could not publicly criticize her father, who was her own blood relative. Swedish intelligence and media published conspiracy theories, accusing her of being an informant, leaking Swedish royal secrets to Germany. Even her private letters to her father were suspected of being coded and threatening national security. Physically, she was in Sweden, but politically, she was a complete stateless person and an enemy. Her outward appearance was tightly controlled. She maintained a straight posture before the cameras and showed no emotion in public. But inside, she was festering with extreme stress and suppressed depression. Sibylla was caught between the jaws of the great beast of history. Her only rebellion was silence and perseverance. The Swedish people hoped she would quietly disappear, while Nazi Germany hoped she would become the center of pro-German forces within the Swedish royal family. Betraying both expectations, she was forced to live a life of silence in the forests of Haga Palace, raising her 4 daughters. In 1945, Nazi Germany was finally defeated and World War II ended. Hitler committed suicide and Europe was liberated. However, for Sibylla, the end of the war meant not liberation, but a new kind of hell. Her father, Karl Edward, was arrested by the American military as a war criminal. He was imprisoned, tried, and sentenced to a hefty fine, ultimately leading to bankruptcy. The once proud German aristocratic family was utterly ruined. The Swedish people rejoiced at the fall of the Nazis, but behind that jubilation, a cold gaze remained toward Sibylla. She was no longer the daughter of a threatening enemy, but of a shameful and defeated war criminal. The chains of blood wouldn't let her go even after the war ended. As a descendant of a defeated nation, Sibylla was forced into an even deeper silence. Yet, amidst this darkness, a miracle finally occurred in April 1946. After 14 years of marriage, Sibylla gave birth to her 5th child and the Swedish royal family's long-awaited first son. He was to become the current king of Sweden, Karl XVI Gustav. The birth of her son was a turning point that would forever change Sibylla's life. Her position within the royal family was solidified, and the mere fact of having a male heir seemed to soften the public's cold gaze. For the first time in a long time, genuine laughter blossomed in Haga Palace. Sibylla finally believed she could escape the long tunnel of political marginalization and contempt and live a respected life as the mother of the next king and future queen of Sweden. She dreamed of a new future, free from the shadows of her past that weighed her down. It seemed the fairy tale, after a brutal nightmare, was finally heading toward a happy ending. But fate denied her even such ordinary happiness. Just 9 months after her son's birth, a violence far more brutal and overwhelming than political hatred awaited her, ready to rain down from the sky. It was a complete destruction, wrought not by human ideology or prejudice, but by gravity and the failure of machinery. The grotesque and terrifying curse of the plane, seemingly aimed at those with fascist blood roaming the royal courts of Europe, was knocking on the door of the Haga palace. In January 1947, the cold winter winds swept across northern Europe. Europe, still scarred by World War II, struggled to slowly regain its semblance of normalcy. Sweden's Haga palace was no exception. In the spring of 1946, with the birth of her son Carl Gustaf, heir to the throne, a miraculous warmth permeated Princess Sibylla's life. The political pressures that had weighed on her, the stigma of being a Nazi's daughter, and the recriminations of having failed to bear a son, seemed to be temporarily lifted. But the clock of fate was designed to stop at the cruelest moment. Sibylla's sole shield and her truly beloved husband, Prince Gustav Adolf, was returning to Sweden after visiting Prince Bernhard and Princess Juliana of the Netherlands. After enjoying hunting and strengthening royal bonds in the Netherlands, he boarded a Dutch Airlines Douglas DC 3-passenger plane from Amsterdam on January 26th, bound for Stockholm. This passenger plane was a pinnacle of cutting-edge aviation technology at the time, but a single seemingly insignificant human and mechanical error derailed a grand historical event. The plane had a layover at Kastrup Airport in Copenhagen, Denmark. After a brief rest, as it prepared to take off for Stockholm, ground crews made a fatal mistake. They cleared the plane for takeoff without removing the gust locks, which had been installed to protect the elevators from damage in the strong winds. This one tiny pin shattered the future of the Swedish royal family and the remaining half of Sibylla's life. At 3:32 p.m., the DC 3-passenger plane zoomed up and down the runway at Kastrup Airport. However, shortly after takeoff, at an altitude of 50 meters, the plane's nose spiraled out of control. A fixed fin prevented the pilot from adjusting the aircraft's angle. The plane soared nearly vertically into the sky, then lost thrust and stalled. It then plummeted to the bottom of the runway. With a loud crash, the aircraft crashed into the ground and was instantly engulfed in a massive fire. All 22 people on board, 6 crew members and 16 passengers, were killed instantly. Prince Gustav Adolf was also burned beyond recognition in the flames. The future king of Sweden was reduced to a handful of ash on the runway of a foreign airport. News of this horrific accident sent shockwaves through Europe. But deep within the public consciousness, a bizarre and eerie rumor spread quickly, transcending mere mourning. It was the so-called curse of the plane, a rumor that haunted European royalty throughout the 20th century. The public immediately recalled another horrific royal air disaster from a decade earlier. The death of Princess Cecilia of Hesse, the older sister of Prince Philip, Queen Elizabeth II's husband, and crown princess of the royal family. In 1937, pregnant Princess Cecilia and her family were on a plane crash near Ostend, Belgium, killing all aboard. Both Princess Cecilia and her husband were ardent members of the Nazi Party, Sibylla and Cecilia. Both women were of German aristocratic blood, deeply connected to the great evil of the 20th century, Nazism, and shared a chilling commonality, a perfect fairy tale marriage, only to have that fairy tale shattered by a downpour of death. People whispered that this was not a coincidence, but a punishment of the times, a judgment from heaven upon those with fascist blood. While it was an accident caused by flaws in science and technology, the public interpreted it as a moral and philosophical curse. This curse frame became the perfect psychological prison, forever condemning Sibylla to an irredeemable tragedy. The moment news of the accident reached Haga Palace in Stockholm, Sibylla's inner self literally crumbled. At the age of 38, she became a widow overnight. But her grief was far more than that of a normal wife. Prince Gustav Adolf was not just her husband. He was her only political and emotional shield in a hostile Swedish society. Here, Sibylla's fatal weakness, passive obedience, emerges in its most tragic form. Having lived her entire life in the shadow of someone, her authoritarian father and husband, she lacks any independent psychological weaponry to defend herself. She is completely defenseless and thrown into the coldest violence the world has to offer. Flags were flown at half-mast across Sweden, and the people were immersed in grief. However, this grief was directed solely at the dead prince, not at the widow Sibylla, who was left behind. This was the most brutal form of alienation perpetrated by the system. In a normal nation, a widow bearing 5 young children would have received national sympathy and condolences. However, in the eyes of the Swedish people, Sibylla remained an ominous stranger, a German woman who evoked the horrors of war. Even the tragedy she endured could not erase the original sin of her origins. While mourning the dead prince, the public still held a cruel gaze mixed with relief. If the prince had lived, that Nazi woman would have been our queen. Sibylla became the most isolated and hated widow in all of Northern Europe. This cold public contempt began to completely control Sibylla's daily life and physical surroundings. Immediately following the accident, her psychological state manifested itself outwardly in extreme depression and obsessive mourning. She covered herself entirely in heavy black mourning attire. She also dressed her 4 young daughters in the Haga Palace in strict black mourning attire. In an instant, the once splendid palace became a vast morgue. She closed the curtains of the palace tightly, isolating herself from physical contact with Swedish society. This extreme silence and mourning she displayed wasn't simply an expression of grief. It was a defense mechanism, a silent protest against a world that loathed her. However, the public and the media didn't respect her closed doors. Even her seclusion was criticized, portraying it as the arrogance of a stubborn German aristocrat, unable to assimilate into Sweden. If she remained silent, she was condemned as arrogant. If she showed herself, she was condemned as shameless. She was trapped in a system where she was condemned no matter what choice she made. Even more horrifying was the weight of political contradictions Sibylla had to shoulder. With her husband's death, her royal position became utterly ambiguous and bizarre. In 1950, her father-in-law, Gustav VI Adolf, ascended to the throne. Under normal circumstances, her husband would have become crown prince and she crown princess. However, with her husband's death, the crown prince position passed to her youngest son, Carl Gustav, who was only 4 years old. She was the mother of the future king, yet she became a contradictory figure, never able to become queen herself. The Swedish royal advisors and government officials found Sibylla deeply uncomfortable. They were deeply concerned that the young Carl Gustav, the future king, would be infected with his mother's Nazi image. This led to a silent isolation within the Swedish royal family. The royal system sought to politically separate Sibylla from her son, the heir to the throne. Young Carl Gustav was to receive a rigorous Swedish education and be raised as a symbol of unblemished Sweden. In the process, His mother Sibylla's German background and her political sins were to be thoroughly whitewashed and concealed. Sibylla's inner self was utterly torn apart. For the sake of her son, her only hope and reason for survival, she had to completely erase her own identity and past. This was a dramatic contradiction between her intentions and the actual outcome. She had arrived in Sweden as a proud German noblewoman, but to save her son as king, she had to transform herself into a ghost. She couldn't explain to her son the tragic accident in which his father died, or why the public hated her so much. Fearing that her young son might hear her German accent, she staunchly concealed her native tongue from him, speaking only broken Swedish. This situation, in which a mother had to deny her own language and history to protect her child, was the most philosophical and cruel tragedy created by fascism and politically motivated marriage. As time passed, the social stigma attached to Sibylla persisted. For decades, she lived alone in the Haga palace, quietly engaging in safe, non-politically charged charitable endeavors, like environmental protection and child welfare. In public, she wore a rigid, hardened smile and maintained a tight control of her emotions. This outward appearance resembled that of a perfectly controlled robot. But beneath that cold skin, the shadow of her father cheering under the Nazi flag in her youth, and the image of her husband's corpse burned on the runway remained a horrific specter, gnawing at her nerves throughout her life. History is the record of the victors, but it's also a massive fabrication born of the prejudices of the survivors. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Swedish society shared a deep sense of relief at having escaped the horrors of war, yet also a deep-seated guilt for having turned a blind eye to the Holocaust. For the Swedish public, Princess Sibylla was the perfect scapegoat to pass on their guilt. By condemning Sibylla as a remnant of the Nazis, they sought to demonstrate their moral superiority. Sibylla wasn't simply a woman born in the wrong era. She was the perfect target for the scapegoat mechanism that post-war European society collectively created to atone for the horrors of fascism. The alienation and contempt she suffered chillingly demonstrate how the crowd's yearning for justice can sometimes be transformed into blind and brutal violence. Sibylla grew old, raising a fatherless prince alone. Her palace was tranquil, but her soul never found a moment of peace. The wreckage of the plane was cleared, the flames extinguished, but the curse of public hatred and isolation never ceased until the day she died. The silence that descended upon Haga Palace after the plane crash wasn't simply an expression of mourning. It was a meticulously orchestrated yet deeply morbid psychological bomb shelter. Princess Sibylla was forbidden even to mention her husband's horrific death. As her 9-month-old son Carl Gustaf, the future king of Sweden, grew up, asking about his father's death was an absolutely forbidden act within Haga Palace. Behind this silence lurked a profound psychological dilemma. Sibylla possessed a maternal instinct not to pass on a tragic past to her son, but she was also acutely aware of how the Swedish public was interpreting her husband's death as a Nazi curse. If the young prince were to learn of the brutal public gaze surrounding his father's death and the bloodline of his mother that had caused it, his ego would shatter. Therefore, Sibylla's chosen strategy was complete information suppression and emotional castration. Later, as an adult, King Charles XVI Gustaf recalled in an interview, as a child, asking about my father was absolutely taboo in my family. It wasn't until I was 7 that I learned from someone else how he had died. This brief confession demonstrates just how suffocating and oppressive the world Sibylla had created was. In the name of protecting her son, she had destroyed the normal familial function of sharing emotions and healing grief. This emotional repression was most devastating to Sibylla herself. In 1954, another death shook her to her core, coming from Germany. The death of her father, Duke Karl Eduard of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Once a British prince and Hitler's most staunch supporter, he was reduced to a war criminal after World War II, losing all his wealth and reputation and dying miserably in poverty and illness in a small West German apartment. The emotional conflict that unfolded within Sibylla at that moment represented the most extreme form of contradiction a human being can experience. To her, Karl Eduard was an oppressor who had brainwashed her into submitting to authoritarian order, the culprit who had branded her a Nazi spy in Swedish society. Yet at the same time, he was a loving father to whom she had devoted her entire life. Yet Sibylla, the Swedish princess and mother of the future king, was denied even the right to shed a tear for her father. Had she publicly mourned the death of a high-ranking Nazi official, a war criminal, the Swedish press would have immediately branded her a fascist sympathizer and marched torch-wielding on Haga Palace. Her grief was utterly politically censored. Sibylla was not even allowed to attend her father's funeral, forced to weep silently in the Swedish forests. This goes beyond simple grief. It reveals the inhumane shackles of a monarchy that forces even the most intimate emotions of individuals to bow before state ideology and public scrutiny. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Swedish society was rapidly modernizing. The foundations of the welfare state were laid, social democracy took root, and the voices of the younger generation calling for equality and freedom grew louder. As Sweden's political landscape shifted sharply to the left and took a pragmatic course, Sibylla of Haga Palace increasingly seemed outdated, a dark and uncomfortable relic of the past. While the public was dynamically changing, Sibylla's time was forever frozen in time in 1947, when her husband died. In this political and psychological isolation, the relationship between Sibylla and her 4 daughters, the princesses of Hagar, also deteriorated. While Margareta, Birgitta, Desiree, and Christina grew into beautiful, vibrant women, they found it difficult to breathe within the thick melancholy and silence their mother emanated. While Sibylla strictly controlled her son, Carl Gustaf, imposing a heavy future as King of Sweden, she was relatively indifferent to her daughters, imposing only the stale German-style discipline. Unable to bear it any longer, the princesses, one by one, chose to escape the Swedish royal family. In particular, the eldest daughter, Princess Margareta, the third daughter, Princess Desiree, and the fourth daughter, Princess Christina, paid the price of giving up their royal titles, highnesses, by marrying commoners. They longed for a life of ordinary freedom, free from their mother's gloomy control and the suffocating gaze of the Swedish royal family, even if it meant giving up their privileges. As the daughters ebbed from the palace, all that remained by Sibylla's side were the cold silence and her young son, still young and still learning the art of kingship. But history presented Sibylla with another burden she found difficult to bear. In 1965, Queen Louise, the second wife of her father-in-law, King Gustav VI Adolf, passed away. With the highest-ranking female member of the Swedish royal family gone, Sibylla's place in the royal hierarchy fell to her. Although she was not officially queen, she was effectively forced to fulfill the role of Sweden's First Lady. This was the culmination of the most brutal and dramatic contradiction that permeated Sibylla's life. the daughter of the Nazis, so hated by the Swedish people. The very woman they had kept cloistered like a ghost in the darkness of Haga Palace for nearly 2 decades was now forced to represent Sweden as a state guest and guest of honor at official state functions. Sibylla's physical demeanor at official functions was poignantly rigid. She wore an expensive dress and a magnificent tiara, but her smile was unnatural and rigid, as if carved with a chisel. Instead of the composure typical of a monarch, her gaze displayed a beastly wariness and chronic anxiety, anticipating a public outcry. The public felt a profound cognitive dissonance as they witnessed Sibylla standing beside King Gustav VI Adolf at a splendid royal event. They applauded her, but the applause was devoid of warmth. It was merely a mechanical courtesy toward the Swedish royal family, a state institution, and not a sign of respect or love for Sibylla herself. Sibylla knew this more keenly than anyone. The role she held as First Lady was not an honor, but a cruel punishment. She had to shake hands with those who had pointed fingers at her, calling her a German spy, and raise a glass to politicians who had shown no sympathy when her husband died. Her life was an empty stage, a spectacle of utter self-deception and performance. This extreme emotional labor and repressed trauma eventually began to destroy her body. By the late 1960s, Sibylla's health had deteriorated significantly. The stress she had endured throughout her life had manifested itself physically in the form of intestinal cancer. The disease ate away at her body as secretly and ferociously as the inner pain she had hidden. Despite this, Sibylla kept her illness hidden from the public eye. It stemmed from a lifelong fear that showing weakness would expose her to public attack. She forced herself to carry out her duties as Sweden's First Lady, suppressing the pain with painkillers. Around this time, Sweden was in the grip of anti-Vietnam War protests and leftist student movements. Young people on the streets condemned the monarchy as an outdated evil and called for the establishment of a republic. While radical political slogans swept the streets of Stockholm, Sibylla lay in a cold hospital bed, awaiting death. The instrument of a vast political conspiracy that had once sought to seize Sweden under Hitler's shadow. Sibylla now languished, destitute of political power and popular favor. She was just a year away from the crowning of her son, Carl Gustav, and the glory she so desperately desired as king's mother. From a philosophical perspective, Princess Sibylla's life was a perfect laboratory for demonstrating how ideology and collectivism can slaughter the individual soul. She never once attempted to become a leading historical villain. Her only crime was blind obedience and a lack of intelligence to recognize the magnitude of evil as evil. Yet history has not forgiven this ignorance and passivity. Simply because she was born into the bloodline of a group that perpetrated Nazism, she became the perfect scapegoat to satisfy the moral obsession of the Swedish public, a people who espouse peace and democracy. The Swedish public's emotional lynching of Sibylla was rationalized through the superstitious packaging of the curse of the plane. By interpreting the accidental accident of a plane crash as a punishment for the times, Swedish society justified its cruelty in neglecting widows and orphans. For them, Sibylla's suffering was justified revenge against the Nazis, and her exile was a necessary isolation measure to maintain the purity of Swedish society. Thus, Sibylla was a double victim of history. She was a victim of a political marriage orchestrated by her fascist father, and simultaneously a victim of a mass lynching by anti-fascist masses who hated fascism. Both extreme ideologies did not regard her as a complete person, but merely a consumable to further their political narratives. Her silence was not simply the result of depression, but her only means of survival against the double violence that threatened to destroy her. The Swedish royal family, which Sibylla had dedicated her life to protecting, ultimately succeeded in preserving the throne for her son, Charles XVI Gustav, through the grinding of her flesh and bones. However, beneath that throne, the bloodstains of a woman who, unable to become a fairy tale princess, was forced to live her entire life as a stranger and a cursed widow, remain vivid. Sweden in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a completely different planet from the 1930s when Princess Sibylla first set foot there. The streets were no longer covered in uniforms and flags. Instead, they were filled with long-haired university students, anti-war protests, and radical socialist slogans. The Swedish government, led by Prime Minister Olof Palme, was building the world's most progressive welfare state. Equality and solidarity had become the absolute religion of the times. In this dynamic and progressive social landscape, Sibylla of Haga Palace was a complete anachronism. For Sweden's younger generation, the royal family was a remnant of an old era that needed to be eradicated, and Sibylla, especially with her stigma as the daughter of a high-ranking Nazi official, was the very thing they hated most, a fossil of the old regime. The public gradually ceased even to criticize her. Condemnation gave way to indifference, and indifference led to the coldest form of oblivion. But there was no turning back for Sibylla. Her lifelong goal remained unfulfilled, ensuring the safe coronation of her son, Carl Gustaf, as King of Sweden. The dynamic between Sibylla and her son during this period perfectly exposed the bizarre mechanisms by which the monarchy distorts and controls individual maternal instincts. The Swedish government and royal family embarked on a massive project to transform the young Carl Gustaf into the perfect modern Swedish king. Central to this project was to completely insulate the future king from his mother and her dark German shadow. Carl Gustaf received a rigorous Swedish education, joined the Swedish army, and trained alongside ordinary Swedish youth. He was designed to be an easygoing and popular monarch, completely free from his mother's rigid aristocracy and authoritarianism. Sibylla silently consented to this brutal erasure. Her fatal weakness, her passive obedience, transformed in her final moments into the most sublime and tragic self-sacrifice for her son. She tacitly accepted the erasure of her own identity for the sake of her son's political survival. She was careful not to let her son adopt her own German accent, and she maintained a certain distance from him in public, building a barrier to prevent the stigma of Nazi blood from spreading to him. It was a crippling psychological torment. She loved her son dearly, but for the sake of his perfect future, she had to leave herself as a complete stranger. As her son grew into a respectable young man, adored by the public, Sibylla withered away alone in a corner of the Stockholm Palace. The lives of mother and son were in a starkly inverse curve. As her son's light grew stronger, his mother's shadow grew darker. An even more astonishing and dramatic contradiction emerged in the movement for constitutional reform in Sweden at the time. In 1971, Swedish politicians reached the so-called Torekov Compromise. At its core, this compromise maintained the monarchy while stripping the king of all substantial political and constitutional powers. The king was now reduced to a purely ceremonial head of state without the power to sign legislation or appoint a prime minister. Lying in her hospital bed, Sibylla had to watch the news on television. The throne her husband had fought so desperately to protect, even at the cost of his life in a horrific plane crash. The crown she had endured decades of public scorn and disgust to pass on to her son was now a hollow shell, devoid of any power. Her father's grand ambitions, his conspiracy with Hitler to seize Northern European hegemony, had culminated in the deprivation of all power by the Madame Fosse king. In an instant, Sibylla's lifelong humiliation and suffering were reduced to a mere farce, but Sibylla never got to see the symbolic crown placed on her son's head. In the fall of 1972, the cancer that had been gnawing at her reached a point of no return. Her father-in-law, King Gustav VI Adolf, was already 90 years old. Sibylla's son Carl Gustav was only months, if not years, away from ascending to the throne. Just before the final finish line, where she would lay down her cross, Sibylla collapsed. Her final days, as reflected in her entire life, were utterly cold and solitary. Royal doctors visited her hospital room, but the Swedish public showed little concern for her illness. On November 28, 1972, as the cold early winter winds of Stockholm blew against the windows, Princess Sibylla died quietly at the age of 64, exactly 40 years after she first set foot on Swedish soil. Her death did not provoke deep mourning in Swedish society. Rather, it brought a subtle sense of liberation, almost a sense of relief, to the Swedish royal family, the government, and the public. The uncomfortable memories of World War II and the gritty remnants of fascism that had lingered in the collective unconscious of Sweden were finally buried forever. Her funeral was solemn, yet devoid of the warmth of sorrow. While a magnificent state funeral was held, the faces of the citizens lining the streets were filled with the indifference of observers bidding farewell to the tragedy of their time. Crown Prince Carl Gustaf followed his mother's coffin silently, raised in such strict emotional control that he was unaware of his father's death until the age of 7. The young man stood before the public with a perfectly trained, expressionless face, even at his mother's death. Sibylla's greatest legacy was the hardened visage of her son, who lived as a cog in the machine of a monarch, his emotions sterile. On September 15, 1973, less than a year after Sibylla's death, King Gustav VI Adolf passed away, and the young 27-year-old Carl XVI Gustav ascended the throne as Sweden's new king. It was the moment Sibylla had longed for. If it weren't for the curse of the plane, she would have sat on the throne with her husband, gazing lovingly at her son. But on the day of his coronation, standing on the balcony of the Swedish palace, the young king found only an empty solitude beside him. The entirety of Princess Sibylla's life ultimately redefined the true meaning of the word curse within the modern era. The horrific plane crash at Copenhagen Airport in 1947 physically took her husband's life. However, what truly shattered her was not the plane's malfunction, but a man-made political curse, the original sin of being the daughter of a Nazi, the shackles of the inhumane system of arranged marriage, the legalized violence of the masses, who mercilessly trampled on foreigners in the name of neutrality and peace. These three cogs meshed perfectly, grinding away at her soul. Though not a perpetrator of fascism, she was forced to pay its price. Though not a coveter of power, she was forced to rot in its coldest shadow. Today, tourists visiting Stockholm, Sweden, admire the beautiful royal palace and the peaceful landscape of the welfare state. King Carl XVI Gustaf, now a graying man, holds the record for the longest reigning monarch in Swedish history. The public reveres his reign and is captivated by the modern royal image exemplified by his commoner wife, Queen Sylvia, and their children. But behind the dazzling window displays of the modern royal palace lies the grave of a woman who has been completely forgotten. Her name doesn't feature prominently in textbooks, and even the Swedes themselves make no effort to remember her. She remains merely a blot on the royal family tree. This is the end of the fairy tale perfected by Princess Sibylla's bloodline. By erasing herself, she preserved her son's crown, and by sacrificing her solitude, she extended the survival of the Swedish royal family. Her silence was the cruelest price paid by 20th century European royal families for survival. The colossal millstone of history crushed her flesh and bones, laying the foundation for the royal family, and upon it a new era for Sweden blossomed. Her punishment, begun in the flames of the airplane, was finally completed in the most complete form of oblivion. With the solitary death of Princess Sibylla, the darkest chapter of Swedish royalty was ostensibly closed. However, the cruel tragedy of political marriage and the shackles of fascist bloodlines that plagued 20th century European royal families did not end in the forests of Northern Europe. The millstone of this horrific tragedy was rolling back to the Balkans, waiting to tear the life of a young woman, the daughter of Sibylla's sister-in-law, Princess Ingrid of Sweden, and the protagonist of one of Europe's most dazzling fairy tales at the time, into a complete hell. This woman was the last queen of Greece, Anna Maria of Denmark. Her story mirrors that of Princess Sibylla, yet the speed and devastation of her downfall are far more dramatic and violent. While Sibylla slowly withered away in the palace as an alienated queen, Anna Maria, just 3 years after donning the most splendid crown, was stripped of everything and forced to flee in the night, becoming a stateless refugee. This fairy tale's transformation into a nightmare was punctuated by the fatal curse of another German nobleman, the infamous mother-in-law, Queen Frederica, who, like Sibylla's father, harbored a dark fascist shadow. Athens, Greece, September 18, 1964. The 18-year-old Danish princess Anna Maria married the 24-year-old King Constantine II of Greece, to the acclaim of all of Europe. At the time, she was the world's youngest queen and a symbol of Scandinavia's unblemished beauty, the Rose of Europe. The streets of Athens were filled with cheering crowds, and the sight of the young, charming king and queen riding in a golden carriage under the Mediterranean sun was a veritable fairy tale. This dazzling procession was a perfectly staged symbol of hope. To the Greek people torn apart by the devastation of World War II and the horrific Greek Civil War, 1946 to 1949, this young and beautiful couple seemed like saviors, capable of shedding the bloody past and ushering in a new era. Anna Maria was a pure being, untainted by political calculation or ideology. She was not suspected of being an enemy spy, as Princess Sibylla had been, and instead of being coldly received by the Swedish public, she entered the royal palace with the fervent love of the Greek people. But this very fairy tale setting was the most deceptive facade that conceived Anna Maria's tragedy. Little did she know she had walked into the midst of a vicious political powder keg. At the heart of this tragedy lay Constantine II's fatal psychological weakness. The young king was robust, athletic, and possessed popular appeal, but politically he was profoundly immature and vulnerable. And most fatally, he remained psychologically immature, unable to escape the oppressive control of his mother, the Empress Dowager Frederica. Queen Mother Frederica. This name is one of the most reviled in modern Greek history. Tracing her origins makes it clear why she became the curse that ruined the life of her daughter-in-law, Anna Maria. Frederica was a German princess from the House of Hanover. She had been active in the League of German Girls, a young women's organization in Nazi Germany, just before World War II. Just as Princess Sibylla's father was a high-ranking Nazi official, Frederica, too, in her teens, donned a Nazi uniform and was baptized into fascism. Frederica's obsession with power was pathological. She spearheaded the brutal suppression of communists during the Greek Civil War, and even during the lifetime of her husband, King Pavlos. She intervened deeply in Greek internal affairs, ruthlessly purging her political opponents. In Greece, the birthplace of democracy, the site of an arrogant German queen wielding fascist power and dominating politics, ignited a deep-seated hatred among the Greek people. Crowds chanted, "German fascists, out." Anna Maria's position within this oppressive political framework laid bare the sheer depth of her misery. While Anna Maria wore the crown of queen, the actual power within the palace was completely held by her mother-in-law, Frederica. Frederica did not treat her daughter-in-law as a partner in state affairs, but merely as a tool for producing a worthy heir to the dynasty. The young King Constantine failed to prevent his mother's arbitrary political intervention and instead hid behind her skirts at every crucial decision. Anna Maria had to play the role of a fairy tale heroine, smiling in public, but behind the closed doors of the palace, she had to hide in the oppressive shadow of her arrogant and meddling German mother-in-law. As the Greek people loathed Frederica, the embers of that hatred began to spread to the royal couple who were bystanders. The fairy tale was merely a hastily constructed set to mask the ugliness of real politics, and the foundations of the set were already crumbling. On April 21st, 1967, just 2.5 years after Anna Maria became queen, the fairy tale was shattered in the most violent way possible. Under cover of night, Greek far-right military forces drove tanks into Athens and staged a coup. This coup wasn't simply a military rebellion. It was an inevitable explosion, born of the constant political interference of Empress Dowager Frederica, the conflicts of progressive politicians opposing her, and the political incompetence of King Constantine. The coup forces quickly arrested key government officials and seized control of Athens. In the darkness of dawn, the royal family, imprisoned in the Tatoi palace, was completely surrounded by armed soldiers. At that moment, the grim reality Anna Maria faced was horrifying. 3 years ago, she had waved to cheering crowds as she rode in her carriage, but now the streets were lined with searchlights and armored vehicles. She was only 20 years old, carrying her eldest daughter, Princess Alexia, and heavily pregnant with her second child, Crown Prince Pavlos. A terrified pregnant woman forced to hold her breath under the watchful eyes of armed soldiers. This was the reality of the most beautiful queen in Europe. Here, King Constantine committed a fatal political miscalculation. Under the pretext of preventing bloodshed, he signed the document presented by the coupists and officially recognized their government. This act was a complete betrayal of the Greek people. While the people had hoped the king would defend democracy against military dictatorship, he chose to become a puppet of the military to protect his own life and throne. 8 months later, on December 13th, 1967, Constantine attempted a counter-coup to rectify his mistake. However, his plan was amateurish and failed miserably in the face of the military's perfect intelligence network. The moment news of the collapse of the royal forces reached the country, a horrific exodus began that would determine the rest of Anna Maria's life. Just before the military arrest squad stormed the palace, the royal family fled in the dead of night. They drove frantically through a bitter winter storm to a military airfield, barely able to afford a change of clothes. The splendid crowns and jewels, the symbols of Greece, and the centuries-old family fortune were all abandoned in the darkness of Tatoi Palace. Anna Maria, holding her two young babies in her arms, dashed down the wind-swept runway and boarded a rickety twin-engine transport plane. Her husband, Constantine, took the helm. The moment the plane took off, their status plummeted from rulers of a nation to fugitives begging for their lives. If Sibylla's husband had died in a plane crash, Anna Maria would have been condemned to political death, banished from her homeland forever. The sheer physical desperation of their escape was nothing short of devastating. The plane was headed for Rome, Italy, but faced severe weather and fuel shortages. With their fuel gauges nearing zero, they managed to make an emergency landing on the runway of Rome's military airport. It was a precarious moment, with only 5 minutes of fuel remaining. The royal family's arrival on the runway was a tragic sight. Anna Maria, a global fashion icon, was seen shivering, clutching her children, her face pale, her coat drenched and rumpled by rain. But what devastated Anna Maria more deeply than this miserable physical escape was the loss of her identity. The military dictatorship immediately annulled the royal family's passports and confiscated their property. Later, they were even stripped of their Greek citizenship. The woman who had until yesterday been a constitutional symbol of Greece became overnight a stateless person, legally inexistent, a phantom, unprotected by any state. That was the end of the fairy tale. After arriving in Rome, Anna Maria experienced extreme stress and internal breakdown. The fear of being hunted, the sense of loss of everything overnight, and the near delusional anxiety of being assassinated at any moment gnawed at her nerves. This brutal psychological pressure ultimately took its toll on her body, leading to the most tragic consequences. Shortly after her exile in Rome began, Anna Maria suffered a devastating miscarriage of her third child due to extreme stress. The image of a young mother lying in an unfamiliar hospital bed, bleeding and losing her child, was not simply a medical tragedy. It was the physical manifestation of the extreme psychological violence that state power and sudden exile had inflicted upon her. She had lost her crown in Greece. Now, in the lonely exile of Rome, she lost the future she was carrying. Even more tragically, even in exile, she did not enjoy complete freedom. While King Constantine and Anna Maria wandered, first in Italy and later in London, England, a dark shadow loomed over them. Their mother-in-law, the Empress Dowager Frederica. Even after losing her country and being driven out, Frederica's authoritarian tendencies remained unwavering. She attempted to maintain control by interfering in every aspect of her son and daughter-in-law's life in exile. Anna Maria was simultaneously a refugee who had lost her country and a captive of her oppressive mother-in-law. This family dynamic exposes the monarchy's most ugliest contradictions. While their nation and people had abandoned them, they remained trapped in the illusion of an old court within their cramped mansion in exile. Despite her defeat, Frederica remained entrenched in her past arrogance, and Constantine remained dependent on his mother. Anna Maria was utterly silenced within this pathological psychological structure. Just as Sibylla was silenced in the Haga palace in Sweden, under the curse of the plain and public contempt, Anna Maria was forced to smother her own ego in exile in London, under the shadow of her fascist mother-in-law. Years passed, and in 1974, the military dictatorship in Greece collapsed. The royal family was filled with hopes of finally being able to return to Athens. However, historical reality coldly shattered their illusions. The Greek people, having achieved democracy, hated the military dictatorship, but they also did not want the return of the monarchy, which they considered corrupt and incompetent. A referendum was held, and the monarchy was permanently abolished by an overwhelming majority. The Hellenic Republic was officially proclaimed. The 1974 referendum was the finalization of Anna Maria's political death sentence. The Greek public, through their ballots, condemned the royal family to permanent exile. The splendid crown she had worn at 18 was consigned to history books. She was left to bear the punishment for her mother-in-law's arrogance and her husband's incompetence. With no homeland to return to, Constantine and Anna Maria left Rome for London, England. Their life in Hampstead, a wealthy London neighborhood, seemed comfortable on the outside, but their inner psychological reality was a perpetual vacuum. The most terrifying psychological pain Anna Maria experienced during this period was the deprivation stemming from comparison. Her older sister, Margrethe II, ascended to the throne as Queen of Denmark in 1972 and enjoyed the absolute love and respect of her people, maintaining a stable reign. Born as two Scandinavian princesses, they both started out as equally glamorous fairy tale characters, but within just 10 years, the older sister had become a powerful monarch, while the younger had become an exiled exile from her homeland. In London, Anna Maria was often invited to royal events by Queen Elizabeth II of England. However, standing in the corner of a magnificent banquet hall, she was the very image of someone who had lost power. She was reduced to a sad backdrop to the splendor of other monarchs. Even more devastating was the death of her mother-in-law, Empress Dowager Frederica, in 1981, and the humiliation she endured at her funeral. Frederica, the culprit, who had so entangled Anna Maria's life and incited the hatred of the Greek people, died suddenly from anesthesia-induced side effects during eyelid surgery in Madrid, Spain. It was a senseless death, but even her death proved to be a devastating political disaster for her son and daughter-in-law. The Greek government, deeply fearful of a monarchy restoration movement, barely permitted Frederica's body to be buried in the royal mausoleum of Tatoi outside Athens. However, the royal family was given only a few hours to return home. Anna Maria and Constantine finally returned to their homeland after 14 years, but the road from the airport to the mausoleum was tightly controlled by heavily armed police and soldiers. Crowds outside the funeral hall hurled curses at the deceased Queen Mother. Anna Maria was forced to stand on the desolate dirt of Tatoi, watching as the coffin of her oppressed mother-in-law was dragged into the ground. As soon as the funeral was over, they were herded back to the airport like criminals and forced onto a plane to London. This was not mourning, but public humiliation perpetrated by the state. But the political lynching didn't stop there. In 1994, the Greek socialist government, led by Andreas Papandreou, passed a law aimed at completely erasing the former royal family from history. It confiscated Anna Maria and Constantine's Greek passports and permanently stripped them of their Greek citizenship. Furthermore, to mock their Danish-German heritage, the government mandated that they adopt the foreign surname Glücksburg instead of their Greek names. This is the most brutal and administratively invasive form of violence, demonstrating how the system can obliterate an individual's identity. Anna Maria, at the age of 20, surrendered her Danish citizenship and even converted to Orthodox Christianity to become Queen of Greece. But 30 years later, the Greek government rendered her legally inexistent. She was forced to live in London and wander the world on a diplomatic passport issued by her native Danish government. stateless. This cold legal term perfectly encapsulated Anna Maria's fractured existence. The crowned lady, unable to prove her name and affiliation at passport control, was forced to rely on Danish documents. The fairy tale the state had created ended in a life of utter excommunication, a ghost. The Greek government's oppression extended beyond the deprivation of citizenship to the confiscation of private property. All of the royal family's private properties, including the Tatoi palace, were forcibly reclaimed by the state. Constantine and Anna Maria filed a lawsuit against this unjust measure with the European Court of Human Rights. This lawsuit wasn't about money. It was a last-ditch effort to prove they were human beings with legitimate rights, not thieves or criminals. After years of bitter legal battles in 2002, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the Greek government's confiscation of assets constituted a human rights violation. The court ordered the Greek government to pay 12 million euros in compensation to the royal family. But this victory was a dramatic contradiction. The Tatoi estate was originally valued at 500 million euros, but the compensation amounted to a mere fraction of that. Even more insulting was the attitude of the Greek government. The government paid the compensation not from the national budget, but from a natural disaster relief fund. This was a calculated political insult, treating the former royal family on par with a national disaster or epidemic. Constantine used the money to establish the Anna Maria Foundation, which helped victims of natural disasters in Greece. While it was a charitable response to a national insult, money could not heal the deep wounds in their hearts. Years later, in 2013, at the height of Greece's economic crisis, the royal couple finally returned to Greece permanently, a full 46 years after their midnight flight from a coup. However, their return was not a glorious one. Instead of a royal palace in Athens, they purchased a modest mansion in the coastal town of Porto Heli in the southern Peloponnese, where they spent their later years. The most horrific and visceral shock Anna Maria encountered during this period was none other than the ruins of the Tatoi palace, where she had spent her honeymoon and given birth to her first children. When I visited Tatoi Palace after half a century, it felt like a massive tomb. Under government neglect, the palace buildings had collapsed. The roof was breached, and the halls where banquets were once held were overgrown with weeds and mold. Thieves had broken in and stolen historical artifacts, and the walls were covered in graffiti. Even the forests surrounding the estate burned during the 2021 Greek wildfires, reducing the former royal tombs to a blackened heap of ash. What must have been Anna Maria's inner state as she walked the halls of the ruined palace? The broken chandelier and weed-infested bedroom were the perfect physical metaphors for her shattered youth and the tragic ending of her fairy tale. The once beautiful queen was now a wrinkled old woman walking on the skeleton of a world she had lost. By refusing to restore the palace, the Greek government turned it into a political display, a constant reminder to the public of the failures of the monarchy. The house where she lived became a stage for the nation's revenge drama. In January 2023, Constantine II died at the age of 82 in an Athens hospital. Anna Maria was finally left completely alone. The former king was not given a state funeral. The Greek government permitted only a private funeral, and despite the presence of numerous royal relatives from across Europe, high-ranking Greek politicians blatantly ignored the funeral. Anna Maria watched silently as her husband's coffin was lowered into the cold earth of the ruined Tatoi cemetery. The woman who had been adored by Athens in a magnificent wedding dress at the age of 18, now a widow at 76, lost her husband amidst the dust of a hostile homeland. A half-century of humiliation and exile brought a futile end to her life. She survived, but her world had long since been utterly destroyed. Princess Sibylla of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha and Queen Anna Maria of Greece. Two women who suffered the most contrasting yet essentially identical tragedies on the grand stage of 20th century European royalty. Sibylla slowly suffocated under the shackles of fascism in the cold isolation of Northern Europe, while Anna Maria was driven out as a refugee in the fiery political explosion of Southern Europe, her identity emasculated. The common thread that dominated their lives was oppression by the system. The monarchy exploited these women's youth and egos, imbuing them with the illusion of a fairy tale. The royal family used them as instruments of political marriage for survival, and the public, in times of political crisis, exploited them as a source of their most vulnerable anger. Sibylla was forced to live her entire life as a scapegoat for her father's Nazi past, while Anna Maria was forced into a stateless wanderer by her mother-in-law's fascist tyranny and her husband's incompetence. Their fatal weakness lay in the limitations of the old system they belonged to and their passivity, their inability to read the changing times. Sibylla blindly followed her father's authority and lost touch with the Swedish public sentiment, while Anna Maria, with her youthful naivety, wandered into a political minefield and lost everything. They were not the masterminds who manipulated power, but merely the most flamboyant pawns, ready to be discarded at any moment to maintain it. The dramatic contradiction between the public eye and their inner selves exposes the most chilling truths of history. While the public condemned Sibylla as an arrogant and stubborn German woman, she was actually a fragile mother, torn apart by depression and the trauma of losing her husband. While the public mocked Anna Maria for enjoying the privileges of a bygone era, her reality was that of a miserable refugee, living on a Danish passport, terrified of miscarriage on an overnight flight. The suffocating silence of Sibylla's voice in Stockholm's Haga Palace and the bitter regret Anna Maria encountered in the ruins of Tatoi Palace pose the same philosophical question. How helplessly is personal truth shattered when the fate of an individual is placed before the violence of state ideology and collectivism? The story of these two women is not the glamorous royal romance recorded in history books. It is a chilling anatomical study of how a human life can be utterly dismantled and discarded when political self-interest and the blind hatred of the masses combine. The curse of the plane and the nightmare of the midnight escape were not accidental misfortunes. They were inevitable monsters created by an era that reduced human dignity to a mere means to maintain old power. And the lives of Sibylla and Anna Maria, completely shattered beneath the jaws of this monster, remain before us as indelible bloodstains of history, testifying to the cruelty of power and ideology. This is the deconstruction of a fairy tale. History has proven that the royal romance so popular was, in fact, a cruel and dangerous gamble, capable of degenerating into the lonely exile of a stateless person at any moment, at the slightest sway of political interests.